You kids ready to learn some routing? Yeah. Maybe first we should define what the heck is routing. That would be a good idea. All right, so let's talk a little bit about React Router. Can I get a volunteer to read this? Sure, Kai. Thank you.
What is React Router? A JavaScript package that allows our UI to stay in sync with our URL. It allows us to render specific components based on which routes match or don't match the current URL path.
Okay, so lets our UI stay in sync with our URL. So think about like your average website. So if you go to like mywebsite.com, at that root level, you would expect to see like a welcome page, like a basic home page, that sort of thing, right? Click on a link, maybe it takes you to like mywebsite.com/users, right? So what would you expect to see on that type of page with that? Yeah, you'd expect to see users, right? So we've not really done anything like that with our React project so far. We've stayed entirely on the root URL. So perfectly fine, you can do it that way, but what if we actually want to change the URL? So it's a bit more information to the end user about where they're at in the application, and it also allows us to do various things based on that. So, but React, we're doing single page applications. In a normal website, like if you click on a link and it takes you to a different URL, that actually makes a request to the server and it serves you up an entirely different page, right? But we're always staying on the same page, so we can't really do it that way. So what React Router does is lets your single page React application basically emulate that. So you can change the URL, you can get parameters out of the URL, do all that sort of stuff, but without ever actually making a round trip and doing an entirely new page refresh or page load. So how do you get started with that? Number one, install it. So there's various React Router packages. The most common one and probably the most popular is the one that's actually called React Router, although I do want to make clear it is not actually part of Facebook's React library. It is somebody else entirely. It's just the most common routing solution, so that's the one we're going to learn. Yes?
Can you do this in like our node for everything, or just in general, like in our terminal?
Oh, like for this would be a like project specific one. So like if your project needs routing, then you would install it by doing one of these commands. Yeah. So, but even for React Router, there's several different packages depending on whether you're doing a web project or a native project. For web projects, it's just React Router DOM. So that's the one we'll be using. And those are the instructions for either Yarn or NPM to do that. And then, so how do we actually get our app to use the router? There's a lot of different ways to do that. I think by far the most simple is, remember our React DOM render? We've not really messed with it a whole lot, but that's the one JavaScript call that actually attaches our app to the index.html, right? So normally, without using router, it would just be app and then the element that you're attaching the app to. So the easy way to start using router is just to wrap your entire app in the router. So once you've got it installed and imported, then just put a router around your app so that way the whole app is under the control of the router. So you could do it over part of the app, you could do it a lot of different ways, but as a general rule, if you're going to use routing, it's going to be for the whole app, so just wrap it in that call and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's how we get our router into our application. And then how do we actually make routes? So like I said, right, so far we've just been at the root route, so localhost 3000 / right? Nothing after the slash. So if we want to do something different with React Router, it's nice. It just gives you a component that you can call a route component. And so that top one is like the most basic form. So the two things you need, I guess you don't always need it, but the first thing is the path, which is just a string. So saying when you match this path, then what component do you want to render? So say I have a widgets component, and if my URL path is mywebsite.com/widgets, then I want to render my widgets component. The one below is a little bit more complicated, but not a ton. So there's a couple extra things in there. Number one is the word exact. So what the exact means is it has to exactly match the path. So for instance, if I had, for that first one, /widgets /1234 or whatever, that would still match /widgets because the first part of it matches. If I wanted it to only match if it was exactly /widgets, then I would add the exact word in there as well. So for the second one, we are exactly matching the path of stuff, meaning there can't be anything else after that as well, or it won't match. And then, if you didn't want to just render a component, you can also just do some inline rendering. So basically what this is doing is an anonymous stateless functional component. So you can just return some JSX. So it's basically just an anonymous arrow function that's returning some JSX, and so that can render as well if you don't have a specific named component for it. Any questions about the routes at all? Pretty straightforward. Just tell it what you want to match and then what you want it to do if it does match. So how do we actually get to the routes, like actually change our URL? Well, React Router also gives us links, and there's two different types. They're very, very simple. So you use a link component and tell it where it should link to. So just tell it what URL you want it to go to when you click on it. Nav links are very, very similar. The big difference is nav links they actually know when they are active. So for instance, if I were to click on the nav link, that would take me to the URL /party. And then also for the link that was rendered, it would also automatically put on a class of active for me. So that way I could do styling different, I could do all sorts of different stuff with it. So link is just a basic link to a particular URL. Nav link also gives you, will automatically know when it is the active link. Like when the URL matches that link, it's going to put the active class on there. All right. What about params? Yeah, Dom.
So earlier you said the easiest way would be to wrap the app in a route tag.
Not a route, a router.
Router tag. If you were to do that, how would you use the path with it? So to check if this is the path, then only you know what I mean?
So once we're inside the context of a router, so the router is wrapping our entire app, then I can use all these other components.
Oh, okay.
So I can't,
Okay.
yeah, so if we didn't have a router around it, I couldn't use route. I mean, I could put it in. I'm not exactly sure what it would do because there's a few more points in a little bit. But basically, once we're inside the router, all of your components inside that router will automatically get a set of props. And so those props include a match object, a history object, and a location object. And they're pretty good names for it because it's just basically that's what it is. So the match object gives you information about what URL you matched to get there. The location is information about the location that you're currently in. And history is kind of what it sounds like. So when you use the forward and back buttons on your browser, that's using browser history. Well, again, we're not actually switching pages, so the browser history doesn't work for that. So you have to have some other way to emulate that. So the React Router gives you that history object that emulates that. So you can still use those buttons, but it's not actually changing location. So another thing you can do through URLs is give parameters to the URL so you can get additional information. So for instance, you can see in the route component that we've got in the My Page component there, the path that we're trying to match that route is /about and then / this weird colon name thing. So that just basically means for that route, it's going to match when I have /about, like exactly that string, and then /something. And whatever that something is, I'm going to assign to a parameter of name. So, and you can see my link right above that is going to /about /Bob. So when I click that link, that's going to change the URL in my toolbar to /about /Bob. That's going to match the route, and so it's going to render this. And again, going back to that match object that we get from the router. So my props.match is going to have a params property on it And then since I told it the param is name, then I can access that value through name. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
Can we name it every time?
No, so I could do whatever. If it was colon Dom, yeah. Oh, you said dog. I thought you were saying your name. I'm like, yeah, you can, if you like to put your own name in your project a lot, you could name it whatever you want. So yeah. So again, that's just kind of arbitrary what you want to call the param, but that's how you're going to access it from inside the component when it gets passed in. Any other questions about that? Awesome. We already kind of mentioned history, so we can navigate by links, so things you actually click on. But say we want to programmatically make people navigate. So like, well, we'll cover some examples in the app we're going to make. But basically, so on that history object that we automatically get passed, so again, it's the match object, the history object, and the location are props that are automatically passed to any component that's inside your router. So the history object has information about where you've been, like all the different routes you've gone to, and it also has these methods on it, so you can call to go different places without the user having to specifically click on something. So probably the most common is push, and pass it a string, and then it'll go to that URL. Go back does what it sounds like, just goes back one. Same thing with go forward, goes forward one. And then there's just the go method where you pass it an integer. A positive integer will go forward. A negative integer will go backwards however many steps. And then you can also block. So if for whatever reason you have a condition in your program where, okay, so when these conditions are met, I don't want them to be able to navigate, then I can use the history object to block navigation. So that is basics of React Router. Has anybody used a framework with routing before that's not React Router? Okay, good. So you don't have any bad habits. I don't want to say bad habits because it's just a very different way of thinking about it. So on most frameworks, they have some concept of routing, but it's what's called static routing, where you essentially just define all your routes in a file and just say, hey, when you match this, render this. When you match this, render this. And it's just one file that contains all these rules, and it only ever matches one at a time. React Router is a bit different, and even previous versions of React Router weren't this way. React Router 4 is very new, and it's the first one to really incorporate what we call dynamic rendering, meaning you can just throw those route components anywhere. You could have 5 of the same route component, and it would render the same thing 5 times, or you could have the same route match, but render different components. So you can just kind of put these wherever you need. So it's a much more flexible. But if you're very used to static routing, like when I first started learning this, that was a bit hard to get my head around because it acts very differently than the majority of frameworks out there. But you guys don't know that, so you'll just learn it this way, and it'll be great. All right, so different note. Not related to React Router, but it is something we're going to use quickly in this project. A few of you in your more advanced levels of homework have called data from an API. So does anybody know what I mean when I say that? Okay, so what is it basically?
Basically send a request to another external source, and the reply is something that you might need. Like I've used it for receiving color names instead of from like pass it a hex number, and it'll pass back a name for that color.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really anything you need if you really know.
Yeah, so basically if I don't have all the information I need in my app, I need to make a request to a server somewhere for some more information, then we can do that with an API call. So basically just saying, hey, go to this address, there's a server there, ask them this question, and then get the answer back from them. So the good news is this is a lot easier to do than it used to be. Used to have to use something called XML HTTP request, which is not horrible, but it's also not particularly fun to use. The good news, like a lot of things, is that there is a much easier way now, just within the very recent past. So it's a good time to learn JavaScript. So there's now a globally available fetch method, which basically just says, hey, fetch me some information. So The Fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, such as requests and responses. Provides a global fetch method that provides an easy, logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. So there are different HTTP requests that you can make. The most common is a GET request, which is what it sounds like get me some information. That's really all we're going to cover today. You can also do POST requests, which is sending information, PUT requests, all sorts of different things. But we're going to focus on the GET because it is the most simple. So for instance, say I've got a Fight Club API that I want to get some information from. I just call the fetch method. And again, this is available globally, so you don't have to preface that with like a module name or anything. You can just say fetch, it's available on the global window object. And give it the URL of where you want it to make a request from. Now we've talked a little bit about promises, but just to quickly go over that again to kind of emphasize that point now that we're actually going to be making calls. So the fetch request returns a promise. So basically, again, going back to why we want to do that. If we did it synchronously, like if I made a request to an external API and we had to wait for that response to do anything else, we would just be sitting there waiting, especially if we had like a slow internet connection. Our user might be sitting there looking at a spinning wheel for a long, long time before they, or if it never responded, they would just be sitting there always waiting on that thing to respond. So it's better to make the call and just say, hey, promise to get back to me. And when you get back to me, and I'm going to go do other stuff while you're getting that information I requested. So I can still keep running. The user can still click on stuff and do things. And then the API promises to get back to me. And then when I get that, I can call this .then method. So it's just whenever you get back to me, then I'm going to do this thing. So we do the fetch request, and then we get the response. We're going to assume that our server responded in a JSON format. And so then you can just call .json on the response that you get, and that'll parse it into an actual JavaScript object. And that's, again, a globally available method, so you don't need to worry about how to get it in there. You can just call it. And then on that parsed user object, then console log it. Now, one thing we've not covered with, we've used a couple promises throughout these few weeks. We've not really covered a catch. A catch is there. So if any part of your promise chain goes wrong and has an error, then you can do something with that error. So it only goes there if something blew up. Otherwise, you're just going to get to the end of your then chain, and that's going to be the last thing that happens. But if there's an error, then we'll just console log that as well. So that's basically how it works. Just call fetch, give it the URL you want it to fetch from, and then when that server gets that information back to you, you can parse it and then do whatever you want with it. Make sense? Cool. Questions? Yeah.
When you're fetching on that server, I guess how do you know what you're getting? Does that depend on the server, or like where do you? I think of servers as like you pass in a keyword or something and then it gives you something back. Is that the right thinking?
Yeah. So we're about to start a project where we'll do some requests from a couple different servers. So generally, that's information you would get from the documentation of the API. So it'll tell you what endpoints a server has, what type of requests you can make, what valid URLs are. So essentially, as long as you give it a valid URL, it should work. But that's where you get that. You're right. You wouldn't inherently know what a server address was.
Just when you call fetch on that URL.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that gives you back. Like, is that a reference to the server and then you can access it, or what?
Well, so like, think about when you go to a website like GitHub. So if you type github.com/your username, that gets you your page. And
All the information pertains to you.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's like a request, but for the HTML page. GitHub also has an API which we'll use, and so you can make the same type of request. You can do api.github.com/a-username, and it'll give you that same information back, all the information about the user, but in a JSON format. So, but yeah, it's all just documentation. View the API documentation to see what requests you can make and what type of information it'll give you back. Good question, though. Any other questions? All right.